Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Sci-Fi Stories. Before we dive into today's tale, we have a small, heartfelt request. YouTube has unfortunately demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue bringing these adventures to you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link in the description or comments below. The official designation of the match was a standard sparring exercise. But as the atmospheric seals locked with a deafening metallic thud and the medical drones abruptly powered down, Carmelo Blum knew the truth. This was not a test of skill. This was a public execution, broadcast live to a trillion mocking eyes. The Interplanetary Military Academy's Grav Arena was an architectural marvel built for a single purpose: the display of absolute, unadulterated power. It was a vast, hemispherical dome, constructed from synthetic diamond and reinforced by interlocking zero-point energy fields. Beneath the transparent floor, massive environmental engines thrummed with a low, bone-rattling frequency, capable of simulating the crushing gravity of a gas giant or the breathless void of deep space in a matter of milliseconds. Tonight, the arena was illuminated by the glaring light of thousands of lumen projectors, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the combat zone. Seated in the colossal amphitheater surrounding the dome were tens of thousands of spectators, representing the highest echelons of the galactic hierarchy. There were the chitinous Krell warriors with their mandibles clicking in anticipation, the towering, four-armed Silarians draped in ceremonial silks, and countless other apex species who viewed the Academy not as a school, but as a proving ground for universal dominance. Into this theater of titans stepped Carmelo Blum. Compared to the hulking alien cadets who usually graced this floor, the young man from Earth looked almost agonizingly fragile. He possessed a lean, compact physique, stripped of the heavy biological plating or natural weaponry that defined his peers. Worse still was his equipment. While the other species flaunted neural-linked liquid metal suits or plasma-forged battle armor, Carmelo wore a standard-issue human infantry rig. It was an outdated, bulky composite of titanium and carbon plating that looked completely obsolete in the face of modern galactic warfare. As his boots touched the luminescent floor, a ripple of laughter and mocking hisses washed over the stadium. The audience did not bother to hide their contempt. To them, the human title of Deathworld survivor was nothing more than an empty, arrogant boast. They believed Earth was merely an unrefined rock filled with soft, fleshy creatures who had somehow stumbled their way into interstellar travel. Today, they were here to see that delusion violently shattered. High above the arena floor, enclosed in an impenetrable stasis glass observation deck, stood Supreme Commander Varric. The towering avian-reptilian hybrid possessed eyes like shards of glacial ice, entirely devoid of warmth or empathy. Varric looked down at the human cadet with a mixture of disgust and calculated malice. Raising a heavily scaled hand, the commander activated the universal broadcasting system. When he spoke, his voice resonated through every speaker in the massive stadium, translating flawlessly into 1,000 different languages. "There will be no mercy in this exercise," Commander Varric declared, his tone cutting through the ambient noise like a vibroblade. "Remove all safety limiters." For a fraction of a second, the arena went dead silent. Then, the grandstands erupted into absolute, unhinged frenzy. The spectators roared, their varied voices blending into a deafening symphony of bloodlust. The removal of safety limiters was unprecedented in an academic setting. The energy barriers designed to absorb lethal blows were dissolving. The kinetic dampeners beneath the floor were powering down. The crowd knew exactly what this meant. They were about to witness the legal, highly publicized slaughter of the weakling from Earth, and they were thrilled. Down on the synthetic diamond floor, Carmelo Bloom did not flinch. His heart rate, monitored by his outdated suit, remained eerily steady. He did not look up at the screaming aliens, nor did he glare at the commander's observation deck. Instead, his dark eyes moved with surgical precision, sweeping along the perimeter of the combat zone. He watched the heavy gravity emitters along the edges shift from a safe, pulsing blue to an angry, unrestricted crimson. He tracked the air pressure relays as they disengaged their safety valves. Most importantly, he noticed the emergency medical bays built into the lower walls. The green lights indicating standby status had flickered and died. The automated trauma drones had retreated into their charging alcoves, their access hatches locking with definitive, heavy clicks. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place within Carmelo's highly analytical mind. Earth had recently petitioned for a recognized voting seat on the High Council, threatening the established political balance of the galaxy. The ruling elite could not simply deny the request without violating their own treaties, but they could prove that humanity was biologically and technologically unfit to stand among the stars. This was never meant to be a test of his combat proficiency. It was a perfectly orchestrated political assassination. Commander Varric intended to silence Earth's voice in the Council forever by turning its most promising cadet into a smear of blood on the arena floor, all under the convenient guise of a tragic training accident. Carmelo took a slow, deep breath, tasting the sterile, recycled air of the dome. He reached down and tightened the strap of his worn titanium gauntlet. They wanted to see exactly what a Deathworlder was made of. He was going to show them. The heavy blast doors on the far side of the arena retracted, revealing his opponent, standing nearly 3 meters tall. Xylar of the Draconian Vanguard was a terrifying amalgamation of biological apex predator and cutting-edge military engineering. His naturally plated, olive-green scales were augmented by a state-of-the-art, neural-linked jet exoskeleton, twin plasma thrusters mounted on his broad back, and thick calves flared with a searing blue light, eager to propel the massive warrior forward. Xylar did not merely walk. He stalked onto the synthetic diamond, his golden, slit-pupiled eyes locked onto the human with absolute predatory disdain. His movements were a flawless execution of textbook military programming, every shift in weight calculated for maximum lethal efficiency. He believed he was stepping on an insect. Without a single word of challenge, the reptilian giant engaged his thrusters. Xylar launched himself across the vast expanse of the combat zone with a speed that defied his massive bulk. He became a blur of dark armor and blue exhaust. His first strike was a devastating downward hammer fist, intended to crush the human into a fine paste. Carmelo did not try to block. To meet that force head-on would mean instant death. Instead, he dropped his center of gravity, pivoting sharply on his right heel. Xylar's fist slammed into the spot where the human's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The impact was cataclysmic. A visible shockwave rippled through the air, and the supposedly indestructible synthetic diamond floor fractured with a deafening crack, sending microscopic shards of crystal flying like shrapnel. Xylar did not pause. Driven by a ruthless, programmed aggression and a deep-seated racial superiority complex, he unleashed a relentless torrent of sweeping kicks, lunging grabs, and brutal backhand strikes. The arena thundered with the sheer concussive force of the reptilian's assault. Every movement Xylar made was designed to end the fight in a single, glorious display of overwhelming power. Against this overwhelming offensive, Carmelo offered absolutely no counterattacks. He became a ghost, employing a desperate sequence of lateral slides, frantic ducks, and rolling evasions. But he could not dodge everything. The sheer displacement of air from Xylar's missed blows acted like invisible hammers. A glancing strike from the reptilian's elbow clipped Carmelo's shoulder pauldron, instantly shattering the outdated titanium composite. The impact sent the human skidding violently backward across the smooth floor. Red blood began to seep through the expanding spiderweb of cracks in his armor, staining the pale gray fabric underneath. His breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps, his body clearly failing under the oppressive kinetic strain. High up in the amphitheater, the audience erupted into a cacophony of whistles, jeers, and cruel laughter. This was exactly the pathetic display they had paid to see. The ruling species of the galaxy pointed their appendages and bared their teeth in amusement, utterly convinced that the match would be over in less than 60 seconds. To the untrained eye of the bloodthirsty mob, the boy from Earth was simply running away in hopeless, pathetic despair, prolonging an inevitable and messy end. They saw a weak animal being chased by a superior hunter. However, far removed from the screaming masses, inside the dimly lit tactical analysis booths, a different story was unfolding. A handful of veteran officers from older, more strategically inclined species leaned closer to their deep diagnostic screens. Their amusement faded, replaced by a creeping, cold realization. The holographic overlays tracing the combatants' movements revealed a startling anomaly. The human was not fleeing at random. Every desperate stumble, every seemingly panicked backward slide, and every agonizingly precise dodge was following a highly complex geometric pattern. Carmelo was deliberately drawing the massive reptilian warrior across the combat floor, luring Xylar to plant his heavy, thruster-powered boots directly onto specific, microscopic glowing junctions. These junctions were the energy convergence nodes, the delicate pressure points of the arena's subterranean infrastructure. The veteran officers watched in muted horror as the data stream scrolled rapidly across their monitors. They realized that Carmelo was weaponizing his opponent's overwhelming strength and arrogant predictability. Every time Xylar missed a blow and smashed his gauntlets or boots into the floor, he released a colossal amount of kinetic energy. The human was perfectly positioning himself so that Xylar's missed strikes landed dead center on the arena's power-routing nodes. Beneath the cracked synthetic diamond, out of sight of the cheering crowd and the arrogant commander, the environmental control systems were choking. The massive kinetic shockwaves from Xylar's attacks were being absorbed by the nodes and forcefully fed back into the arena's hidden power grid. The dampeners were screaming under the unnatural load. The gravitational regulators and the cryogenic coolant pipes were absorbing thousands of terajoules of raw, unmitigated kinetic force. Carmelo Bloom was bleeding. His muscles were burning, and his bones were rattling from the near misses. Yet, behind the visor of his shattered helmet, his eyes were cold and calculating. He endured the pain, silently counting the staggering surges of kinetic energy being pumped into the floor. He was not just surviving the onslaught, he was actively turning the pride and unrestrained power of the galactic elite into a ticking time bomb. The arena was gorging itself on Xylar's destructive force, and the subterranean systems were rapidly approaching a catastrophic, irreversible overload. The trap was almost fully set. The draconian giant decided it was time to finish the hunt, engaging his thrusters to their maximum capacity. Xylar launched himself high into the artificial sky of the dome. He intended to bring both of his massive, armored fists down in a devastating meteoric strike that would flatten the human into the synthetic diamond. The air screamed as his immense bulk descended, carrying enough force to breach the hull of a light cruiser. Directly below the descending behemoth, the frantic evasions of the human cadet ceased. Carmelo came to an abrupt, jarring halt. He did not brace for an impact, nor did he look for an escape route. Instead, he positioned himself perfectly over the exact epicenter of the microscopic fractures he had spent the last several minutes orchestrating. He lifted his heavily booted right foot, locking his eyes onto the plummeting reptilian predator. With a sharp exhalation, Carmelo drove his titanium-reinforced heel down into the compromised floor with every ounce of strength his body could muster. The timing was immaculate. The downward strike acted as the final catalyst for the dangerously overloaded environmental nodes beneath their feet. The synthetic floor did not merely crack. It underwent a catastrophic, localized disintegration. A massive crater opened up in the center of the combat zone, violently swallowing the diamond plating and exposing the labyrinth of subterranean machinery. The destruction instantly severed the primary control grid for the gravimetric dampeners. What followed was an absolute disruption of the fundamental laws of physics within the dome. The environment inside the barrier was violently thrown into a state of severe gravitational anomaly. In one heartbeat, the ambient pull dropped entirely to zero. Xylar's descending strike met empty air, and his own tremendous momentum sent him spinning wildly out of control into the weightless void, his thrusters firing uselessly into the vacuum. Then, just as abruptly, the system violently overcorrected. The gravity spiked to 4 times the standard planetary normal. Xylar, suspended mid-air, was slammed down into the ruined floor with the force of an industrial press. His heavy exoskeleton groaned under the sudden, immense weight, and the breath was violently forced from his lungs. The gravity continued to oscillate wildly, swinging unpredictably between weightlessness and bone-crushing pressure every few seconds. Beneath the wreckage, the massive cryogenic cooling mains ruptured under the strain. Thousands of gallons of supercooled liquid nitrogen flash boiled as they hit the ambient air of the arena. A geyser of blinding, freezing white mist erupted from the crater, expanding outward with explosive speed. Within moments, the dense fog swallowed the entire combat zone, plunging the arena into a suffocating, impenetrable whiteness. The sudden, extreme drop in temperature caused ice crystals to form rapidly over everything it touched. For the reptilian warrior, this was an absolute disaster. Xylar's cutting-edge visor relied heavily on thermal imaging and infrared tracking to locate his targets. The sudden influx of sub-zero nitrogen completely blinded his technological sensors, reducing his multispectral display to a wash of useless, static white noise. He was deafened by the shrieking of ruptured pipes, disoriented by the shifting gravity, and totally blind in the freezing mist. But for Carmelo, the sudden descent into chaos was an awakening. The human species had not evolved in a sterile, perfect laboratory. They were born on a volatile world categorized by galactic cartographers as a Class 9 Deathworld. Earth was a crucible of tectonic upheavals, sudden blizzards, blinding sandstorms, and unpredictable atmospheric violence. Deep within the genetic code of every human lay an ancient, primal instinct built specifically for surviving absolute environmental catastrophe. As the gravity dropped to zero once more, Carmelo did not panic. He simply pushed off a floating slab of debris, navigating the weightlessness with intuitive grace. When the gravity spiked to 4 times normal, he rolled with the pressure, keeping his profile low and letting his muscular structure adapt to the heavy burden. He shed his civilized military training like a useless second skin and fully embraced the feral, adaptable nature of his ancestry. Moving silently through the freezing, blinding fog, the bleeding cadet transformed into a phantom. He became one with the violent storm he had unleashed. He had taken their perfect, sterile proving ground and forcefully terraformed it. The arena was no longer a stage for an execution. It was a miniature, chaotic ecosystem. It was a true representation of the harsh, unforgiving environment that birthed humanity. High above in the grand amphitheater, the deafening roar of the bloodthirsty crowd died in their throats. The massive holoscreens projecting the fight had completely lost their visual feed, choked out by the dense nitrogen storm and the electromagnetic interference of the broken gravity generators. Millions of spectators from across the galaxy sat in stunned, breathless silence, staring down at the massive dome that was now completely filled with swirling, angry white smoke. The only thing left was the audio broadcast, pumping through the stadium speakers, raw and unfiltered, was the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. It was not the steady rhythm of the human. It was the increasingly terrified, ragged gasps of the draconian giant, utterly lost and hunted in the dark. Inside the swirling vortex of flash, frozen nitrogen, the draconian vanguard was losing his mind. Xylar roared, swinging his plasma-infused heavy gauntlets in wide, desperate arcs that cleaved nothing but empty, freezing mist. His state-of-the-art combat artificial intelligence, housed within his neural link, was experiencing a complete logical meltdown. The predictive algorithms were designed for stable, predictable environments. Now, with the gravity oscillating wildly from 0 to 4 times the planetary normal every few seconds, the processor could not calculate a stable trajectory. The heads-up display inside his helmet flashed with cascading red error runes. The thermal sensors were entirely washed out by the extreme cold, and the sonar was bouncing uselessly off the dense particulate matter of the fog. He was encased in billions of credits worth of military hardware, yet he was utterly blind, deaf, and stripped of his spatial awareness. A few meters away, hidden perfectly within the white abyss, Carmelo Bloom had closed his eyes. His shattered visor was completely useless, so he simply deactivated it, plunging himself into absolute darkness. He did not need synthetic sensors. He was relying on something far older and far more sophisticated. He was tapping into the deep, evolutionary biology of a predator, born on a world that constantly tried to kill its inhabitants. As the gravity fluctuated, Carmelo's inner ear fluid adapted instantly, a biological gyroscope refined by millions of years of bipedal balance. He felt the microscopic shifts in air pressure against the exposed skin of his face and arms. Every time Xylar swung his massive fists in a panic, the Draconian displaced a huge volume of air. Those invisible pressure waves rippled through the dense fog and washed over Carmelo, painting a vivid, three-dimensional map of the alien's exact position and posture in his mind. Furthermore, the heavy, frantic stomping of Xylar's armored boots against the broken synthetic diamond floor provided a perfect acoustic resonance. Carmelo was echolocating, using the sounds of his enemy's terror to pinpoint the joints of the massive exoskeleton. The human moved. He did not charge. He glided through the freezing vapor, his footfalls completely silent, perfectly timing his steps with the rhythmic clanking of the alien's armor. Xylar spun around, firing his wrist-mounted pulse cannons blindly into the fog. The searing bolts of energy sizzled harmlessly away into the abyss. In that brief moment of overextension, a shadow materialized directly beside his extended arm. Carmelo did not aim for the thick biological scales or the heavily plated chest piece. That would be a waste of kinetic energy. Instead, a pair of human hands, bare and bleeding, darted out of the mist with surgical precision. Carmelo gripped the exposed hydraulic coupling right at the underside of Xylar's right elbow joint, applying a sudden, violent torque exactly as the gravity spiked to 3 times the normal weight. Carmelo used the alien's own downward momentum against him. There was a sharp, metallic screech, followed by the sickening pop of high-tension cables snapping. Xylar bellowed in agony, not from physical pain, but from the sudden, terrifying loss of motor control. His right arm, along with its integrated pulse cannon, went completely dead, hanging uselessly at his side. The Draconian swung his left arm wildly to swat the attacker away, but there was nothing there. The human had already vanished back into the mist. The psychological terror began to set in. Xylar was a soldier of the vanguard. He was trained to fight armies, to breach fortresses, to trade blows with creatures of equal or greater mass. He was not programmed to fight a ghost that dismantled him piece by piece in the dark. A minute later, the gravity suddenly dropped to absolute zero. Xylar floated helplessly, his heavy boots losing all traction. He desperately tried to fire his back-mounted thrusters to stabilize himself, but before the ignition sequence could complete, He felt a sudden weight on his back. Carmelo had used a floating chunk of debris to launch himself silently through the zero-gravity void, landing softly on the broad, armored shoulders of the giant. Before the reptilian could even register the physical contact, Carmelo's fingers found the manual release valves of the plasma thrusters. With a rapid, practiced motion, learned from countless hours of studying alien schematics in the Academy archives, the human twisted and yanked the primary fuel lines. Highly volatile blue fluid sprayed into the freezing air, instantly crystallizing. The massive thruster pods, now dead weight, detached and drifted away into the fog. When the gravity slammed back down to 2 times the planetary normal, Xylar crashed heavily to the floor, unable to brace his fall without his thruster stabilizers. He was now a grounded, one-armed mountain of useless metal, thrashing blindly in the freezing dark. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, his golden eyes wide with a primal fear he had never known existed. Then came the final, chilling strike. Xylar felt a cold, deliberate tap on his chest plate. He froze in absolute terror. Slowly, out of the blinding white vapor, the bloodied, bruised face of the human materialized mere inches from his own. Carmelo's expression was completely devoid of anger, hatred, or malice. It was worse. It was the absolute, chilling calm of an apex predator observing a cornered prey. Carmelo reached out and gently gripped the heavy, reinforced breathing mask clamped over Xylar's reptilian snout. The Draconian tried to resist, but his remaining servos were sluggish, freezing up from the sub-zero temperatures that the human seemed to be ignoring through sheer evolutionary willpower. With a single, fluid motion, Carmelo triggered the emergency release latches on the sides of the helmet. The pressurized seals hissed, and the heavy mask was ripped away, exposing Xylar's face to the freezing, unbreathable mix of raw nitrogen and dust. The giant collapsed to his knees, clutching his throat, his gills flaring uselessly as he suffocated in the synthetic storm. The hunt was over. Up in the observation booths, shielded from the chaos below, the silence was absolute. The veteran military commanders and high counselors stared at the tactical readouts, their skin crawling. The telemetry data was unmistakable. The human had not overpowered the Draconian with brute force. He had unmade him through terrifying intellect and pure biological superiority. A dreadful realization began to dawn on the oldest, most battle-hardened minds in the room. For decades, the galactic community had viewed humanity's reliance on diplomacy, their constant smiling, and their desperate pleas for peaceful coexistence as signs of inherent weakness. They thought Earth was a soft planet that had to beg for protection. Now, looking down at the surgical, bloodless dismantling of one of the galaxy's most lethal warriors, they understood the horrifying truth. The humans were not weak at all. They were simply holding themselves back. Their diplomacy was not a plea for help. It was a leash. They had been suppressing their own terrifying, predatory instincts in a desperate attempt to prove they could be civilized to the rest of the universe. And today, Commander Varric had foolishly forced one of them to take the leash off. Xylar's massive frame shuddered against the ruined floor, his reptilian lungs heaving desperately as the freezing nitrogen choked him. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by the hollow emptiness of total defeat. The giant who had entered the arena like a god of war was now nothing more than a broken, suffocating casualty. Carmelo stood over him, the freezing mist swirling around his battered, obsolete armor. The human did not raise his hand to deliver a final blow. The battle was won. Then, cutting through the hiss of ruptured coolant lines and the erratic hum of failing gravity drives, came a sound. It was sharp, synthetic, and rhythmically accelerating. Beep, beep, beep. Carmelo's head snapped toward Xylar's chest cavity. His combat instincts, honed by the relentless paranoia of his homeworld, recognized the audio signature instantly. It was not a life support warning. It was a thermal runaway cascade. High up in the shielded observation deck, Commander Varric's cold, avian eyes remained entirely impassive. His meticulously laid plan had gone horribly awry, completely derailed by the feral unpredictability of the Earth-born cadet. The human had not only survived, but had thoroughly humiliated the Academy's premier vanguard. Leaving the boy alive was no longer a political option. If the Council saw this recording, Earth's standing would skyrocket. So, Varric had quietly reached under his console and initiated Protocol Zero, a remote override, bypassing all safety interlocks on Xylar's neural-linked armor. He initiated a catastrophic overload of the Draconian's primary microfusion reactor. It was a brilliant, utterly ruthless contingency. A sudden, massive explosion would vaporize both combatants and destroy the immediate telemetry data. The official report would practically write itself. A tragic, unforeseen hardware failure caused by the primitive, reckless tactics of the human cadet, resulting in the death of a noble Draconian warrior. Earth would face galactic sanctions for their negligence, and Carmelo Bloom would be nothing more than a cautionary tale. Down on the frozen floor, the heavy, armored chestplate of the fallen alien began to glow with a sickly, searing orange light. The thermal radiation immediately began to melt the ice crystals that had formed over Xylar's scales. The giant opened his golden eyes, staring down at the expanding heat source resting directly over his own heart. He knew that sound. Every Vanguard soldier knew the sequence for a critical reactor breach. Xylar looked up, past the blinding fog, toward the general direction of the commander's observation box. The terrible truth washed over him. He had not failed because of his own incompetence. He was being erased. His life, his decades of loyal service, his entire existence was being discarded to cover up a political assassination. A heavy, despairing groan rattled in Xylar's throat. The proud predator closed his eyes, his massive shoulders slumping in absolute surrender. He stopped gasping for air. He was a dead man, strapped to a bomb with a countdown of less than 20 seconds. The blast radius of a microfusion core would easily consume a distance of 200 meters, turning the center of the arena into a crater of molten glass. Any rational being, any creature operating on logic and self-preservation, would have turned and sprinted toward the heavily shielded perimeter walls. Carmelo Bloom did not run away. Instead of fleeing the doomed giant, the human threw himself directly onto Xylar's massive chest. Up in the grandstands, the millions of spectators who had regained their audio feeds and partial thermal visuals gasped in unison. The High Counselors leaned over their balconies, their multifaceted eyes wide with utter incomprehension. The human was actively leaping onto the explosive device. It made absolutely no sense. By all known laws of the universe, a Deathworlder was supposed to be a creature of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. They were supposed to be selfish, violent, and primitive. Yet, here was a human, willingly staying inside the kill zone of a thermonuclear detonation. Carmelo's hands, stripped of their protective titanium gauntlets, grasped the edges of the searing hot chest plate. The temperature of the casing was rising exponentially, easily surpassing 400 degrees. The smell of burning synthetic fabric and roasting flesh filled the air as Carmelo's bare skin pressed against the superheated metal. He did not scream. He ground his teeth together, his jaw muscles jumping as he desperately searched for the manual release catches. "Hold still," Carmelo barked, his voice hoarse from the freezing nitrogen, yet completely steady. "Do not move a single muscle, or we both burn." Xylar's golden eyes snapped open in sheer disbelief. The alien stared at the bruised, bleeding human, who was actively burning his own hands to a crisp, just to save the very creature that had tried to smash him into a paste 5 minutes ago. The primary latches were fused shut from the heat. Carmelo's fingers slipped, leaving smeared blood and blistered skin across the smooth, glowing armor. The high-pitched warning tone accelerated, transitioning into a continuous, ear-splitting whine. 10 seconds. "It is locked," Xylar rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Leave it. Run, human." "Shut up," Carmelo growled, entirely rejecting the alien's surrender. Carmelo looked around frantically and spotted a jagged, half-meter shard of synthetic diamond that had been blown clear during the floor's initial collapse. He grabbed the razor-sharp crystal, ignoring how it sliced into his palms, and jammed it brutally into the seam between the fused armor plates. Using his entire body weight, the human leaned back, turning the diamond shard into a makeshift lever. The muscles in Carmelo's arms bunched and strained against the impossible resistance of the military-grade alloy. The heat radiating from the core was so intense, it was beginning to scorch the hair off his forearms. 5 seconds. The metal groaned. Carmelo let out a primal roar, twisting his torso and putting every ounce of his kinetic energy into the pry bar. With a violent, ear-shattering crack, the heavy chest plate snapped off its hinges and clattered away into the mist. Exposed beneath a web of sparking wires and boiling coolant lines was the microfusion core. It was the size of a human fist, pulsing with an unstable, blinding white light. Carmelo plunged his ruined, bleeding hands directly into the burning cavity. He ignored the agonizing shock of raw electricity coursing up his arms. He found the magnetic housing unit, clamped his fingers around the scorching cylinder, and ripped it completely free from the armor's power grid. 3 seconds. The core was going critical. It was vibrating so violently, it felt like it was trying to tear itself apart in his hands. Carmelo spun on his heel, his eyes scanning the chaotic environment. He could not just throw it away. The blast would still vaporize them. He needed a sinkhole for the energy. His eyes locked onto the massive, glowing pylons at the edge of the arena, the primary shield generators that kept the audience safe. Using the flawless, instinctual kinetic calculation that only a human could muster under pressure, Carmelo drew his arm back. He channeled every remaining shred of his strength into his shoulder and hurled the blinding white core across the ruined dome. The unstable reactor flew through the freezing fog like a dying star, sailing straight toward the heavily reinforced energy intake port of the nearest shield pylon. 1 second. Carmelo dove backward, throwing his body entirely over Xylar's exposed face, using his own back as a final, desperate shield against the impending inferno. The microfusion core detonated inside the heavy energy intake port of the shield pylon. The explosion was a blinding sphere of incandescent plasma that instantly vaporized the lingering nitrogen fog. A shockwave of unimaginable kinetic force tore through the dome, shattering the remaining synthetic diamond flooring into fine dust. Yet, exactly where Carmelo and the massive draconian lay, there was a pocket of absolute stillness. The human had perfectly calculated the structural blind spot created by the towering shield generator. The destructive wave washed completely over them, leaving them untouched within the eye of the artificial storm. Up in the observation deck, Supreme Commander Varric slammed his scaled fists onto his console, his avian features contorted in unhinged fury. The human was still breathing. The miserable creature from Earth had defied the mathematical certainty of the fusion bomb. Seizing the main broadcasting microphone, Varric screeched a frantic command. "Security detail. Breach the combat zone immediately. The Earth cadet has utilized an illegal, unregistered explosive device. This is an act of terrorism. Apprehend him, and authorize lethal force if he resists." Heavily armed shock troopers, clad in riot armor and carrying charged plasma rifles, poured from the lower access tunnels. They marched across the smoking ruins of the arena, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around the exhausted human and the battered alien. A dozen red targeting lasers painted Carmelo's chest. But before a single shot could be fired, the stadium underwent a massive technological seizure. Every single colossal holographic screen ringing the amphitheater, suddenly flickered. The Academy's emblem dissolved, replaced by streams of raw, encrypted data scrolling at dizzying speeds. Then, the screens locked onto a single, damning image. It was a recorded telemetry log, magnified thousands of times for every eye in the galaxy to see. At the center of the display was the exact command code that had initiated the fusion core overload. Right beside it, blinking in glaring red text, was the undeniable biometric signature of Supreme Commander Varric himself. Carmelo Bloom slowly pushed himself to his feet. His muscles shook from exhaustion, and his hands were severely burned. But he stood tall. He raised an arm and casually wiped a smear of blood from his cheek, flashing a tired, utterly triumphant smile at the observation deck. "Did you really think I smashed the floor just to make some fog?" Carmelo's voice echoed through the hijacked audio system, calm and dripping with razor-sharp intellect. "When I collapsed the environmental nodes, the system had to reroute power through the secondary emergency channels. That created a massive data bottleneck. It gave the rudimentary artificial intelligence hidden inside my outdated suit exactly 2.4 seconds of unmonitored access to hack directly into your private transmission feed. Commander." The grandstands descended into absolute uproar. The High Counselors, previously stunned by the human survival, now roared in indignation at the irrefutable evidence of a political assassination plot. Down on the floor, the captain of the security detail stared at the screens, then looked at the human who had just sacrificed himself to save a foreign vanguard. The captain raised his hand, signaling his squad. In flawless synchronization, the heavy shock troopers lowered their weapons from Carmelo, pivoted sharply, and aimed their plasma rifles directly up at the Supreme Commander's observation box. Varric was trapped, his treacherous scheme laid bare before the entire universe. A heavy, clawed hand gently rested on Carmelo's shoulder. Xylar, the terrifying draconian giant, had managed to stand. The alien warrior looked down at the bruised, burned human not with contempt, but with profound, unwavering reverence. Without a word, Xylar offered his uninjured arm, supporting the weight of the human who had spared his life. Together, the apex predator and the Deathworlder walked slowly out of the smoking ruins of the arena. They left behind a completely silent stadium and a universe forever changed. On that day, the galactic hierarchy learned an indelible lesson. The true terror of Earth did not lie in raw muscle or brutal savagery. It lay in a staggering intellect built for pure survival, and an indomitable, terrifying humanity that absolutely refused to surrender to the dark. Hello once again, dear listeners, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. We would love to know where you are listening to this story from today, so please leave a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed today's tale of survival and triumph, we kindly ask for your help. Since our channel cannot earn money through traditional ads right now, a small donation of just $1 makes a massive difference. Your support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and keeping this channel alive so we can craft even more amazing sci-fi stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the donation QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. Thank you for your kindness, and we will see you in the next story.